Hello, Foreign Entanglements viewers. My name is Rob Farley. I'm an assistant professor at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. And with me is...
Michael Cohen, fellow of the Century Foundation, columnist at Foreign Policy, The Guardian, blogger at the Daily News, and just having returned from the Democratic and Republican conventions.
Right. You went to both of them. I mean, that was the Democratic and the Republican conventions.
Yes, I went to both, and actually, I'm just wearing my one piece of swag that I actually got from the convention, which is my Twitter Vote T-shirt. So I'm very, very proud of this. I got this in Tampa. But yeah, I was at both, and it was a fascinating experience. Just on the basic thing, Charlotte's much nicer than Tampa for those of you who are considering vacation in the near future.
Now, is that just a weather thing, or I mean, do you just genuinely prefer North Carolina to Florida?
Well, I wouldn't say about the state in general, but I just found Tampa to be not the most exciting city in the world, and kind of like a sauna. And Charlotte had a little more character, and the weather was, except for some terrible rainstorms, was much nicer.
Right. I mean, I'm going to go out and just confess something straightforward, and I actually made this point repeatedly on Twitter and on the blog. This year, I did not watch even a minute of either convention, so really, I'm at your mercy with regards to what actually happened. I mean, really, anything could have happened, as far as I'm concerned.
You know, a crazy old man could have yelled at an empty chair, for example.
A crazy old... No, actually, one of my friends had a very funny comment on the blog. It's like, well, do you really need to watch the convention anymore? Because with Facebook and Twitter, you know if something crazy like, you know, an old man yelling in a chair for 10 minutes would happen, and then you can just watch it, right? So you don't actually have to be there. Although, you know...
Yeah, and I have to say, I mean, this is a bit of a digression, but I think really interesting the way that Twitter drove the reaction to that Eastwood speech. You know, I was on the floor when it was happening, and it was uncomfortable, but it wasn't, you know, the people around me weren't sort of just, you know, looking at themselves like this is horrible. But on Twitter, it was just blowing up. And I'm convinced that, you know, the reporters and the pundits all saw their Twitter feeds going crazy, and they probably it was a pretty crazy event. I mean, don't get me wrong. But I think it actually inflated to some extent how crazy it was, and I think it became more of an issue than it might have been had Twitter not existed.
Right. No, it's fascinating, and for very parts of both conventions, I would have, you know, my tweet deck up on half my screen, and I would be trying to ignore what was going on in the speech, but I couldn't because there were simply these cascades, and you know, it reminded me of nothing so much as the best scenes in the first Matrix, right, where somebody would be sitting there and watching all these numbers and stuff floating by without having any sort of grasp of reality. But Twitter sort of fulfilling that function with all of these individual data points just sort of coming down my screen, and I'm trying to interpret them, or in my case, doing my best to, usually unsuccessfully, to ignore them. So
Right.
So I guess since you're the one who was actually there, and I think you wanted to start with the Democrats. I mean, I guess what were your impressions, especially but not exclusively foreign policy impressions, with regards to how the first and then the second, or the second and then the first convention played out?
You know, the DNC, I was really struck by, you know, how self-confident Democrats were and optimistic they were. Which, you know, you'd think they'd be a little more defensive considering, you know, what the state of the economy is right now. But I definitely sensed that they were a more unabashedly confident and unabashedly liberal than I would have imagined. On abortion and gay marriage, they were you know, not backing away from those positions, very vocal in supporting them. I thought, you know, Elizabeth Warren's speech, I think, is not getting enough attention because it was overshadowed by Bill Clinton, but a really, like, you know, very strongly populist, anti-wealthy, anti-business kind of a speech. It was really something I think I haven't heard in a long time, the Democratic convention. And then I think, you know, obviously they were great speeches. Michelle Obama was great. Bill Clinton was really extraordinary. I mean, I overshadowed Obama to a large extent. His speech was effective, but I didn't think it was great. But on foreign policy, where the self-confidence part really came out, you know, there was a moment there when, in Obama's speech, when he made a joke about Romney and Ryan being new to foreign policy, and it was sort of a remarkable moment. I mean, it's almost like a transformational moment when you have a Democrat so clearly just, you know, going after Republicans as being inexperienced on foreign policy. It was a striking thing. And also, I mean, you know, at the same time, I mean, Democrats were very tough on military issues, on veterans issues, on killing bin Laden. I mean, there was a martial tone a little bit to some of the discourse there, which also tells me that as much as they feel confident going after Republicans politically, they're still kind of playing on Republican turf when it comes to talking about the military and talking about America being the greatest country in the world, indispensable nation.
Right, and so it's almost a confidence. I mean, the way you're framing it there, and I think the way that a lot of people on, again, Twitter and the blogs framed it, was that there's almost a confidence in that they have successfully adopted a series of tropes and successfully controlled a series of tropes that many Democrats have identified as being sources of Democratic weakness in the past.
I think that's right. And
now, go
ahead. Sorry.
Well, I mean, let me flip this other thing with regards to Democratic confidence, because if there's one blog that everybody should be reading, it's Nate Silver's blog, and Nate Silver's blog with regards to where the election stands today and so forth. Reading it, and Silver has sort of become, his forecasts are not exactly confident, but they have increasingly tended to favor Obama.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Do you think that because of Silver and people like him, but and this is a digression, but because of Silver and people like him, but especially him, that we are starting to move past the idea that there are these kind of crux moments, critical moments where a campaign can be derailed or destroyed, and that rather part of the source of this confidence that you see among the Democrats, and perhaps a bit of worry on the part of the Republicans, is a greater understanding that there are certain structural in a certain structural environment in which every election happens, and that those structural factors at this point simply favor Obama, right? And so therefore, could some of the Democratic confidence be coming from that, and could some Republican worry be coming from that?
What's fascinating about that?
It hasn't been in the past.
I think it's interesting. There's these waves of how people view this. Like for years, people sort of focused on campaign effects. Journalists did, and I think historians did to some extent. And they overstated the argument to the point where political scientists kind of pushed back on this and said no, right, it's much more structural. And they've actually gone, I think, way too far to the extreme of saying that the structural stuff is all that really matters, and you can basically predict who's going to win 6 months out, and the campaign doesn't really matter that much. And it's weird that Nate, who I think probably thinks that's more, I think would agree that argument's gone too far, is in a way, as you put it, contributing to this sort of structural argument of how campaigns are going to play themselves out. I mean, I think in this particular cycle, it's weird because Nate is the only person out there who's really bullish on Obama. I mean, there's a lot of people who think he's going to win. I mean, I personally think he's going to win, but I think he is decidedly more bullish than most. Right. But I don't. And
we should also note that Nate's model is not a political science model in the same sense that he's taking structural factors and then right. I mean, his model is very poll heavy combined with structural factors, right? And yet that has resulted in a very bullish for Obama forecast.
Right, and look, here's the thing. It's hard to come out of these conventions. I mean, I am not the swing voter here, and I recognize that. But it's hard to come out of this kind of this 2-week process and not sort of sense that the Democrats have the advantage. The Republican message was very harsh and very uncompromising, and very narrow, very narrowly, I think, tailored to their base of supporters. And it was sort of pessimistic almost. I mean, I didn't come away from those events feeling like they really had sensed that America's better days were ahead of them. I mean, they kept saying they would be better if Obama were to lose, but why'd be better aside from Obama not being president? I wasn't clear on, and that's because they were pretty bare bones on sort of talking about what their plans were for the future. You go to the DNC and there's much more optimism. There's much more self-confidence. It just was much more inclusive. I mean, that's the other thing too, by the way, that's really interesting to me is that, you go to the DNC and it feels like you're in America in a sense that or actually more you're in New York, so I should say, because it's an incredibly diverse group of people. I mean, incredibly diverse. Black, Hispanics, Asians, gays, straights, you name it. I mean, it was a very diverse crowd and had a very sort of inclusive feel to it. You go to the RNC, it feels like you're at Sunday brunch at a country club. I mean, it's a very different feel. It's a very white-dominated party, and older white, and you can't go there and not feel that kind of extreme. So from that perspective, I don't know. The DNC.
I mean, would it be better to say the DNC is more your America, right? The America that you and to a lesser extent I, because I live in Lexington, Kentucky, and things are different. Than,
of course, right. And I live in a blue state, you live in a red state, so it's interesting on that. But I do think that what you're seeing with the DNC is kind of what's emerging in America, where you have increasingly this country's getting browner. Increasingly, young people are voting Democratic. Country's getting less religious, a bit more secular. I mean, the trends are moving away from Republicans. And so you're right that in the sense that what I'm seeing is sort of my version of America looks like.
Right.
But I think it's also what the future of America looks like. And I think that's the part that if I'm a Republican, I'm very, very concerned about. You have a convention dominated by older white, or a political party that's based as older white voters. That's not a long-term growth strategy. And when you've alienated the fastest-growing minority group in the country, Hispanics, and young people overwhelmingly support Democrats, that's a problem. It's a big problem.
Right. And then, and this is only a partial counter-argument, but the partial counter-argument is that this is going to be one of the last elections that we see this particular Republican coalition, right? That, that in any system that is structurally similar to the United States, you're going to have, two parties that mostly get between 45 and 55% of the vote. But this particular Republican coalition is very circumscribed in terms of how long it's going to last, right? And so, 4 or 8 years from now, we are going to see a different coalition that will, and it may have birth pangs, but we're going to see a different coalition that will sort of almost of necessity have to be more inclusive of at least some of those groups who are currently part of the Democratic coalition, right? And there are a whole variety of people that can be targeted, right? I mean, there are certainly elements of the gay community that are receptive to Republican arguments. There are elements of the Latino community who are receptive to certain Republican arguments, right? Right now they seem to be, and it's not 100% clear that it's wrong, but they are banking on making this particular coalition work at least this time, maybe the next time. But I mean, it seems to me that everybody understands, or not maybe not everybody, but there's an understanding that this coalition is going to have to change in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and that's the thing that comes across is that I felt like this election is kind of the last hurrah for sort of 60s era Republican politics. And what I mean by that is sort of backlash style politics based in sort of white resentment politics that Republicans have been using for 40 years now, and quite effectively. You feel like this is the last hurrah that they have. If they lose this election, they're not going to be able to do that again. And the problem they have is I don't see how they broaden their coalition in the near term, because they are dominated to an extraordinary degree by a group of individuals who are, I think, very upset and frustrated and scared about the changes that are happening in this country right now. And I think, yeah. And I just think there's a point. I mean, you look at Hispanics as a good example of this, right? I mean, Hispanics, are generally somewhat socially conservative. I mean, and I heard this a lot when I was in Tampa, that they're going to vote on economic issues, and it's just not happening. Republicans are getting 20 to 30% of the Hispanic vote, and that's because of their views on immigration. And I just don't see how Republicans in the near term square that circle. How do they get back? How do they appeal to Hispanics? And do they run the risk of losing this minority group for a generation? Of Hispanics who basically come into politics and say we're voting Democratic, and they stick with the Democratic Party. That's a real problem for them.
Right, and it bears mention that the GOP has even moved back from the position it held 8 years ago, right? I mean, say what you will about both Karl Rove and George Bush, and even about Rick Perry, right? Perry and Bush and Rove all sort of fundamentally understood these limitations on the, especially with regards to Latinos, but I think among Bush, probably even, Bush and Rove probably to some degree among gays and other groups too.
Yeah.
That this was a card that had, a limited lifespan. And it's, in that sense, sort of surprising that they have sort of moved even more aggressively in that direction since since 2004. So,
and I'll say one other thing too, if I might, just on this issue, is the women's vote. And I got to say, the Democrats, I mean, we're just pounding away at this notion that their attention toward women voters. You had Sandra Fluke, I mean, no one knew who she was, a year ago, and she's speaking in prime time at the DNC. It was crazy, and she did it. It was actually a tough speech, I have to tell you. But they really, really were pushing the abortion issue. They were pushing on Planned Parenthood, on contraceptive. They were pushing against Republicans' sort of the pro-life agenda pretty harshly. And there's a reason for that. They have a huge gender gap. And again, it's hard to see how you rectify that when you have Republicans who have such uncompromising positions on abortion.
Right.
Among other issues, I should say, not just abortion.
Among others. Well,
I mean, abortion is only part of the reason why women vote for Democrats, but that's it's also just the general focus on poverty, on social justice that tends to appeal more to women than male voters.
Right. Drag this back to foreign policy just a little bit.
That's like we should, yes.
Is there? But I want to stay on this gender issue too, because I know that in the past, and it's always there have been lots of arguments about why, what are the sources of the gender gap, and simply the evident positions of both parties on reproductive rights have always seemed pretty compelling to me. But people have floated in the past to the argument that the hawkish foreign policy of the Republicans turns women off in some fashion, which I've never been sure that's actually true. But it provides a nice segue into now a Democratic Party that pursued what a lot of neutralish observers and a lot of leftish observers have said was a very hawkish foreign policy, not necessarily in terms of specifics like we have to invade country X, but in terms of the symbolism and imagery of American power, American prestige, and so forth, and that has is a significant change between now and say even 8 years ago. And other people have disagreed. I mean, I guess did you go to 2008 or 2004? I mean, so do you have a comparative for either the past conventions as well, or is this the first time you've been?
I was there in 08. I hadn't been in a long time before that. I was there in 90. I was in 92 as well. I think. I mean, here's the thing. I mean, here was what's so striking about it. They were very self-confident on foreign policy. The Democrats were. They had a good message, and the Republicans bizarrely just didn't even talk about it. I mean, they didn't even address the issue in a significant way. I mean, Condi Rice gave the only speech I would consider to be a foreign policy speech, and it was full of platitudes and was very vague and wasn't really a trumpeting of Republican foreign policy views. Romney, I counted 206 words in his acceptance speech on foreign policy, most of which, by the way, were lies or just not true. Something was not true, especially the apology tour thing he tried out again, which is not true. It was very striking to me that they just didn't want to talk about it. And I've seen some speculation that it's because their party divided between neocons and internationalists. I don't buy that at all. I just think they don't have a message. They have nothing to talk about on foreign policy. They have their arguments are that Obama has weakened the U.S. I don't think they're true. But even no matter what I think, I don't think most Americans who see Obama as the guy who killed Bin Laden see this as a really serious argument to be made. And I think the Israel stuff plays to a very narrow band of voters and mainly, frankly, evangelicals. And I don't think it makes much difference in the election.
Right. And sort of the other three ways in which you might demonstrate being hawkish, which would be being hawkish in Iraq, and everybody thinks that's a terrible idea in the Republican Party because it would be a terrible idea to be hawkish in Iraq. Nobody seems to sort of really perceive, besides Bill Kristol and a few of his people, nobody really wants to take on 2014 mostly withdrawal date.
No.
And even China hawkery does not seem to be playing all that well, right? And even to the extent that China hawkery is playing well, it's almost playing well in terms of a trade war type argument rather than a real war type argument,
right?
Which Obama does just as well as Romney on, right? Or perhaps even even better, right? So Romney's not really scoring any points in China in the way that previous Republican presidential candidates scored on the Soviet Union. Threats. Even Iran is not really playing a huge role, and
But do you know? Can I just say
whether that can be folded into the Israel question is maybe something we could talk about. But even to the extent that they're not even really talking about how much we need to bottle up or go to war or whatever else with Iran, and that's sort of interesting.
Well, I'll just say one thing on China that I found really fascinating. That Obama mentioned China in his speech, and he did in the context of basically holding their feet to the fire on economic issues, which, I was a little surprised by. I mean, that's another thing Romney would have said, which I think he did say, actually, in his speech. China was one place where I always thought Republicans could have exploited opportunity of basically, using them as a boogeyman and saying that Obama hadn't gotten tough enough. And they have done that to some extent, but not really aggressively.
Right.
And not in a way that I think has helped them very much.
I think the problem with China is that there is a very real, very genuine and identifiable China divide in the Republican Party. And from the stuff I've read, the business community, takes very seriously, and the business community that supports the Republicans generally takes very, very seriously whenever Republicans start badmouthing China and whatever Republican presidential candidate, because of the immensely lucrative and critically important ties that the United States and China have economically, right? And so any sort of whispering that we're returning to the Cold War, in any kind of suggestion like that, is very problematic for that part of the Republican coalition. And I don't think you've seen that play out in public, but, I would suspect it's playing out in private to the extent that probably Romney feels constrained about talking about China in very aggressive terms.
I think that's right. And I think, he has been very harsh on China. And if you look at the op-ed he did, I think it was earlier this year, it was basically one attack after another and didn't really offer much in the way of sort of a positive gloss on the U.S.-China relationship. But it's all rhetoric, and I think you're right. I agree with you that the reason it didn't come up at the convention and the reason they may not emphasize it much because I think it upsets, key constituencies and the GOP. I just think in general, I mean, what's interesting is that, and this goes back to my initial point, Democrats have really moved, to the right is not maybe the right way to put it, they've become much more aggressive on foreign policy, and they've co-opted the issue from Republicans. This is what Clinton did in the 90s on crime, on welfare, on tax and spend, on a host of issues. They moved right, and they kind of neutralized their vulnerabilities on those issues. And now they kind of own some of those issues, actually. It's to some extent. I mean, not completely. And on foreign policy, I don't think Democrats are going to own this issue. I don't think they're all of a sudden be seen as the more trusted party. I think for them, it's a question of how do we neutralize this as an issue, and they've done that. And I don't know how Republicans get that back in the near term. And I think that's a problem for them in the sense that they've long utilized foreign policy as a way to attack Democrats, and a way to sort of prove that they're better stewards of the country because they know how to they understand the world better. That doesn't play as well as it used to, and I think that's a problem for them. But what's a bigger problem for all of us talking about foreign policy is that I don't get the indication Democrats are inclined to be more progressive on foreign policy. I mean, maybe they will be, and I am hopeful. But what I heard at the convention was a lot of stuff that suggests, we need a strong military. We need to be responding to threats around the world, even though they don't really exist. We need to be aggressive. There wasn't the kind of, internationalist, sort of multilateralist talk that I would have liked to hear.
Right. But what we have not seen a return to sort of the how the two parties interacted on defense issues in the 1950s and the 1960s, right? Which is so different than, I think, the time period in which you and I grew up and sort of came of age. With Reagan and Bush and so forth being and Republicans generally being hawkish, right? But, in the 50s and 60s, the Democrats would periodically be extremely hawkish on defense, right? Would periodically argue that the Republicans, like Eisenhower, were gutting national defense, right? And we're not actually seeing that here, right? I mean, we are not seeing a reversal of sort of what has become the traditional Republicans favor higher defense spending while Democrats favor lower defense spending, right? I mean, whatever Democrats may say about having a strong military and about having at least a somewhat interventionist military, they are still embracing a degree of defense cuts that the Republicans are simply unprepared to argue for, right? And
Well, can I say, I think it's a little more subtle than that. So I wrote about this a few months ago in Foreign Policy, a piece on this. What they're doing is really interesting. The Democrats are attacking Romney for wanting to raise defense spending, right? And Obama said that last night. He said, he wants to spend money the military doesn't even, on things the military doesn't even want. So that was one line, but he didn't say we want to cut defense spending, and they're not going to say that because that opens us up to certain charges of weakness. So I think what they're doing is it's a very kind of maybe too cute by half approach of trying to attack Romney for being profligate and being reckless on foreign policy, on defense spending, while at the same time not really, preaching their own sort of need for cuts. Look at what Panetta did after the sequestration. He was basically saying this was going to, invite aggression against the U.S. I don't get the sense that the administration is going to go along with defense cuts, I think, because they're popular, but they don't see it as some, radical revamp of U.S. foreign policy or national security priorities. And I think that's the problem, actually. I think they're willing to play this game, where they look like more competent Republicans in foreign policy.
Right. I guess I have a little bit more hope in this regard that, especially with regards to the defense budget, you'll see, and I guess one thing we're talking about is just arresting growth, right? But arresting growth is something.
Yes.
And I guess whether we define arresting growth as being better Republicans or worse Republicans. With regards to Panetta, I think it's very hard typically for any sort of defense secretary, and I know it's happened in the past, but it's rare that defense secretaries come in and then sort of argue for defense. They argue for more
Dick Cheney
spending.
did it. Dick Cheney did it, didn't he?
Right. There are counter examples, and there are also historic examples where you like, for example, with McNamara, where you have very vigorous arguments for more careful defense spending rather than necessarily less defense spending. With Panetta, he sort of has to make friends within the department too, and it's hard to do that when you're coming in to argue for cutting.
But I agree. But his rhetoric was so over the top that it makes it much harder, I think, to move forward with serious cuts to the defense budget. But can I just say, for the record, I actually am kind of hopeful too. I'm hopeful in the sense that I think that Obama's instincts are to be a more restrained foreign policy president, and I think it's a lot easier to be that person if you've killed Osama bin Laden. And if you've gotten troops out of Iraq, and if you wind down Afghanistan. I have been very critical of Obama in Afghanistan, but, I'm also have to praise him for actually sticking to his deadline and bringing troops out. And so I think, look, there's campaigning and there's governing. And I actually think that if elected to a second term, Obama has a potential to be transformative foreign policy president. I think his instincts are in the right place. But this is an election, and if there's one thing you've seen from this administration on foreign policy, it is extraordinary risk aversion, and they are not taking any chances. So they are hammering away on the bin Laden stuff, on going after Romney for being reckless, on sort of talking about the indispensable nation rhetoric. That's I think more campaign than anything else. But campaigns matter. It's harder to walk back that rhetoric than I think maybe they realize. But it's. I'm actually somewhat hopeful that things could be that Obama's second term would be a relatively good foreign policy, better at least in the first term.
Right. Okay. Well, let's take this opportunity and let's do it and you were at both places, and so you saw who the people giving speeches were and who the people regarded as important were, and so forth. For both administrations, for both a notional Romney and a notional Obama second term. Who do you see as the primary foreign policy players? Now, obviously, in the Romney or in the Obama case, Biden will remain as a prominent foreign policy player. But I guess first, what do you think that a second-term Obama team is going to look like, and then what do you think the first-term Romney team will look like?
It's a really great question, and
I asked it. I only ask good questions.
Yeah, right, of course. I think the first term foreign policy team was pretty weak. I think Hillary's been a good Secretary of State, but she's not really a strategic thinker by any means. I think Gates and Jones were basically picks that were made in order to give Obama cover on getting out of Iraq and some extent on Afghanistan. I think the best, what I always was hoping was that the person who had the most dominant foreign policy voice in the Obama administration was Barack Obama. I think his instincts are actually pretty good. I trust him a lot because of where he came down on Iraq in 2003. That showed me someone with good instincts on foreign policy. I think, I don't think you're going to see this team repeated for a second term in an Obama administration. I don't think you're going to see Hillary at fucking bottom. I think you'll probably see John Kerry there. That's my guess.
Now, do you think that the Obama administration is going to risk another special election in Massachusetts? Put John Kerry into the Secretary of State?
That's a good question.
I mean, I don't ask that facetiously. I mean, I think it's a serious concern, right? Because even Scott Brown could run again, right? Scott Brown could run for, even if he loses to Warren, which is a very iffy proposition, he could then run for Kerry's seat.
That's true.
Yeah,
that's true, and that would impact whether they picked him or not. I don't know. I mean, personally, I actually like John Kerry. I think he gets a bum rap because of the 2004 race. I think he ran a pretty good race. I think he'd be, probably a good person to be at state. I don't know. I mean, I hate these predictions. I never have any sense of what's going to happen. I'm always wrong when I try to predict this stuff. I just think what would tell me something positive about where the administration is going in foreign policy is if they don't play this game of sort of picking people who will give them political cover, but pick people who are real thinkers and who've actually who are not just sort of check the box kind of characters like I think Jones was and I think like Gates was. They win a second term, they're going to have much more, I think, ability to be effective on foreign policy and to actually operate with somewhat of a wide berth. I don't think they're going to have to worry as much. They don't have to worry about re-election. I don't think they have to worry about Republican attacks as much. I think they can be a little more assertive on foreign policy. The question is, will they want to be? And part of the thing is they will, if only because what are they doing in domestic policy? It's not like Republicans are going to suddenly turn around and say, you know what, now we want to work with this guy. I mean, Obama's identity gets frustrated in the House and Senate as well. Foreign policy is a place where he can have an impact. So, maybe he gets more aggressive on Arab-Israeli peace, or maybe he, gets more aggressive on talks with the Iranians. Who knows? I do think that, it might be out of necessity where he ends up devoting some of his energy in a second term.
I mean, just to go back a second, who are the other plausible candidates for Secretary of State in the second term?
Oh, man.
Besides Kerry?
It's a good question, actually.
I mean, Kerry is the only name that I've seen floated. I guess, yeah, it's the only name that I've seen floated. Maybe I haven't been paying close enough attention, but...
I mean, who would it be? I mean, actually, you know what? It's a great question. I don't have a good answer for you. I don't actually... Because most people that I can think of who are prominent people are sort of former Clinton people. They're sort of very conventional kind of picks. And I mean, who would he put at defense, for example? Would he keep Panetta there? I kind of doubt that he would, actually.
Well, I suspect Panetta will be there for a little while.
Maybe
on the first term, and so Panetta might stick another 2 years, and then half or something like that. The composition of the Senate and the degree of hostility in the Senate will be part of the issue. So,
I mean, the one name that got floated a lot, in the first when he first got elected was Jack Reed, who he seems to have a good relationship with. I don't know if Rhode Island is a safe enough place where you take that chance, but that was one name I've heard out there. But you're right. It's interesting. There's not a great bench of people out there who would be considered Secretary of State material. Here's the one dark horse person: is someone like Susan Rice. Would she get? I mean, she get National Security Advisor. She get Secretary of State. And the thing with Rice is that, to her credit, she was somebody who, like Obama was against the Iraq War, was with him very early. Again, I haven't followed her as closely this administration, but she seems to have relatively good instincts when it comes to use of force. Even on Libya, people might argue with that, but I thought she was actually, I think Libya looks better now than it did at the time.
I mean, that'll be interesting. So let's flip it and do the Romney side. Are you one of the people who believes that John Bolton has any chance of being Secretary of State, or no?
I mean, yeah, it's possible. I mean, look, I mean, to my mind, if Romney wins...
I mean, I don't see Romney buying himself that kind of headache, right? I mean, Romney's a smart guy. Bolton is not a team player. And I very much suspect that Romney is going to take someone who he's comfortable with.
Well, who would that be? Who would that be?
Zellick? I'm not sure. I mean, I really don't know.
I mean, but look what happened when they picked Zellick. I mean, the right wing freaked out over that.
Right, but after he's president, who cares? Right? I mean, I guess that's
he's going to care. I mean, I disagree with you.
Maybe
I mean,
will.
I think the one thing that Romney will take away from this campaign is that you can't piss off the far right. And they will take you on if they have to, and they will run against you.
Right. But the far right that you have to worry about for electoral purposes is different than the far right that cares about foreign policy, right? The far right that you have to worry about in an election doesn't care about the difference between Zellick and Bolton. It's people who are in the halls of the Heritage Foundation and AEI and so forth, and those people are important and relevant to a Republican administration, but those people are utterly incapable of delivering elections.
But look at it this way. Look at it from this perspective. If you're Romney, you want to avoid at all costs upsetting, the Tea Party wing of which is the Republican Party right now. You want to avoid upsetting them, and that's going to be a big problem on a host of domestic issues. So why create more problems for yourself in foreign policy when you probably don't even care about foreign policy all that much?
Right, but the Tea Party doesn't really care about John Bolton either, right? I mean,
no, but that's true. But
the Tea Party does not have coherent foreign policy views, and to the extent that they do, they're actually fairly similar to Rand Paul's, right? And Rand Paul is not a John Bolton kind of guy.
No, but that's not. But they don't. Tea Party doesn't care about foreign policy. The people who care about foreign policy care about it a lot, and they'll make a problem. Like they'll make trouble for Romney to pick someone they don't like. So it doesn't have to be Bolton, but I think if it's Zellick, you would open yourself up to getting attacked for that, and I don't think they want to risk that. I mean, I think that actually is probably it's a risk aversion. I just think they'd pick somebody who wouldn't cause them any problems, who the neocons would be happy with. I'm not sure who that would be.
Who's a happy medium between those two figures? You could pick George W. Bush.
I'm sorry?
You could pick George W. Bush.
I mean, it's funny in a way that the best person, the one person who'd give me some relief would be Steve Hadley.
Right.
But I don't know how well he's perceived among the far right. I imagine not well, but he's a guy who would be an excellent pick for Secretary of State in public administration. But again, he might be too Bob Zellick-ish to get picked. I don't know. I think on Bolton, I think you're probably right. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine that they would take that he is so incendiary. Maybe they'll give him like national security advisor. Maybe they'll try to get him to the UN again. Who knows? But I think you're going to see. I think a Romney administration, would be a very neoconish dominated administration. Because look, that's where the intellectual energy is in the GOP foreign policy community.
Sure. Oh, yeah.
As to much there is any intellectual energy, it's
right.
with the neocons. And if you're Romney, you don't want to piss these guys off, and so you might as well just play nice with them.
Right now, and I guess I would have to agree that the reason not to pick Bolton is not because Bolton is a neocon, but rather because Bolton is just incapable of being a team player. And so that Romney will almost certainly look elsewhere to someone who, will at least pretend to do what the president wants on a day.
Here's one other name is Mitchell Reese, who I don't know if he gets Secretary of State. That seems a bit of a heavy promotion for him, but maybe a national security advisor. And he seems like somebody who actually is well liked on all sides. I think that's my sense of him at least. So that's one possibility, I suppose.
Right, that's interesting. Right. I mean, who else? What about SecDef for Republicans? Do you have any guess? The problem with this is that the United States should have shadow cabinets, right? The parties, and I understand that there are certain formal reasons why you can't, but you could still, as George W. Bush was more clear on who would be cabinet nominations, that we should have an opportunity for knowing who these people will be before people are elected, right?
Let me ask you.
We sort of have to play guesswork on that.
Let me ask you a question: Who in the Senate or the House would be a good Republican Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense? I can't think of anybody. And I think
I know a lot of people like Randy Forbes for Secretary of Defense.
That's
I
interesting.
think that he is. I mean, he might. Maybe
That's
he doesn't have sort of the esteem and prestige quite yet, but he's well liked among Republicans who genuinely know stuff about defense issues.
Right.
And he asks the right kind of questions, and he might be an interesting player. And he's a House, not Senate, right? So you're not risking losing a Senate seat if you nominate him. So I mean, I don't know. That might be a possibility.
I mean, you really want to be funny, you could pick Dick Lugar for Secretary of State. That's not going to happen. But I just think, in general, I mean, I think that the big, Democratic line on the Republicans is that, they would return things to the Bush years on foreign policy. I think it's probably a little bit overstated, to be honest. I don't think there's a lot of enthusiasm out there for more aggressive foreign policy. But I think the reason to be concerned about a Romney presidency is not so much who he'd pick for these positions or how near-conscious he would be, is that he has no experience. And he has, and I think in the end, that's the biggest check against him, is that he has no experience, Ryan has no experience, and the people around him are people who have bad experience or bad instincts. And Obama had very little experience, but he had good instincts. And I think if there's one lesson to look at from the last, 60 years of American foreign policy, is when you come into office with that experience, that leads to trouble. George W. Bush, Jimmy Carter, LBJ, I would include Truman. I think those, when you have people who have poor instincts and not much experience, that tends to lead to bad decision making. And so I think that's what's more concerning. And I'll tell you one thing which I find fascinating is that it used to be the Republicans were really good on foreign policy. I mean, think about Nixon and Bush and Reagan. Less so Reagan. At least he had a clear worldview. I wouldn't say he was great on foreign policy, but people like Nixon and Eisenhower and George H.W. Bush, I mean, they were actually had thought about these issues. I mean, I get no sense anyone in the party has done that recently.
Right. And this is, Obama didn't have a ton of experience, but he had a lot of interest in foreign policy, and there's little to make it clear that either Ryan or Romney have a lot of interest. And obviously, I mean, Biden was somebody who had an abiding interest in foreign policy.
Right.
And so the Republican ticket is sort of... What about John McCain? What about John McCain for Secretary of State?
Well, I think you get defense, wouldn't he?
I mean, I think you could put him... I don't think he would take defense, actually. I think he might take Secretary of State.
I mean, John McCain would be a horrible Secretary of State. I think if 08 shows anything, it's that John McCain has terrible foreign policy instincts. I mean, it would be more like someone like Joe Lieberman or Lindsey Graham. I mean, I think actually that'd be interesting pick if they were for Sec Def or Secretary of State. It wouldn't. McCain, I think, is too old, and I think to some extent he's almost like, I don't want to say a liability, but I mean he's crazy on foreign policy. I mean his speech at the convention was insane, and he has. It's what's fascinating about McCain as a character is that the experience has it bounces off of him like he has a Death Star shield around him. Like he takes nothing away from Iraq or Afghanistan, any lesson at all, except we just do more of the same. I mean it is rather stunning how uncreative a thinker he is on foreign policy.
Right. The Lindsey Graham or Lieberman are both very interesting figures. Lieberman would sort of you could see him being very attractive for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, the neocons love him.
Right, exactly. And he's sort of just partisanship and so forth, blah blah blah. So that's interesting. Well, I mean, from my point of view, I hope we never find out. But
I don't think you're going to. I mean, that's my big takeaway from the last 2 weeks. I don't think you're going to find out. I think we're going to have a discussion in about a month or 2 months from now about who's going to be Secretary of State in the second term for Obama.
Right.
Although I don't think, unfortunately, that your home state is going to be. Actually, unfortunately, your state's not probably going to be voting for Romney at this point.
No,
I can't imagine that will be changing anytime soon.
No. Kentucky is quite likely very heavily for Romney. Although Lexington went for Obama about 65-35.
Yeah,
2000.
really.
8. So Lexington will go for Obama, and Louisville will go for Obama.
But just one last point. I mean, we should make this the last point. But I was thinking about your Senator Rand Paul. I mean, he gets talked about a lot as a 2016 potential candidate, and I'm curious what you think about that. Is he somebody who has national appeal?
I have actually thought a great deal about this. I think that 2016 will be a very interesting choice for Rand Paul. There are a whole bunch of different potential variables here. But the one thing you have to remember about Rand Paul in Kentucky is that in terms of Senate races, Kentucky may be a very red state for the presidency, but the last several Senate races have been very close.
Right.
And Rand Paul's victory was relatively close. Mitch McConnell's victory was very close against and this was in 2008, and it was a Republican or a Democratic wave, but his victory was very close against a Democratic candidate who was not regarded as strong.
Right.
And if 2016 is not a Republican wave election, Rand Paul is in significant jeopardy of losing his Senate seat, even if all he does is campaign for a Senate seat.
So why not run for president?
Right. Well, there are two ways to think about it, right? Because he's not going to be president. Rand Paul is not going to win the nomination. I'm going to call it right here. Rand Paul is not going to win the 2016 GOP nomination. Rand Paul can make a lot of interesting noise in the 2016. He can co-opt his father's fraction of the Republican Party, presumably with his father's support. He can win a little bit more on the edges because he's closer to the Republican mainstream on a variety of issues. He's young, he's good-looking, he's relatively well-spoken. He's not going to win the Republican nomination because there are too many vested interests that loathe everything about the Paul faction of the party.
Yeah.
And so I would be shocked. And so he is going to be spending, if he runs for president, he might even come in second. It'd be like something along the lines of a Jesse Jackson in 1988 race, where somebody consistently does very well and has absolutely no chance of winning the nomination. I think that if he does that, he significantly endangers his ability to win the Senate seat.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a really unfortunate situation for him that he has to run for the Senate the same year if you want to run for president.
Right, and Rand is not popular with the Republican machine in Kentucky. He's gotten more popular.
Not at all.
He's gotten
not at all.
better.
They hate him, don't they?
Well, they hate him less than they did a couple of years ago, in part because he won and because he's been relatively well behaved, but he's not in good with the McConnell machine. If they see that he might lose, they might run somebody against him in the primary, in the Senate primary. My feeling is that unless he is 100% dedicated to keeping his Senate seat, he's not going to keep a Senate seat. And it's very possible that he could end 2016 being not president and not senator. Even if we sort of imagine this world in which Romney loses right now, and so he's running, or the 2016 election is for an open presidency. Obviously, I think all of these are much, much worse if Romney were to win and Rand were to run in the primary against Romney. Then I think essentially the Republicans are at least no chance of winning his Senate seat. So he's in a much different situation.
That's interesting,
than his father was.
And it's interesting also on this question of who would run for the GOP in 2016. I mean, this came up a little bit when I was in Tampa, and I think it's sort of it's sort of a pointless conversation. I have no sense whatsoever of what happens the next 4 years in American politics. If Republicans, if the economy improves, if Republicans moderate their positions a slight bit, a smidgen, my sense is Republicans are in serious trouble over the long term, in very serious trouble. But, historically, parties don't win 3 races in a row, so, who knows?
Unusual. Right.
I'm sorry?
No, it's unusual for parties to win 3 times in a row, and so even though you can imagine a variety of futures where the 2016 candidate for the Democrats can campaign on peace and prosperity. There will be prosperity in the second term, which we all hope there'll be, and peace won by Barack Obama, and so now moving forward and win sort of a George H.W. Bush 1988 style election. But I mean, those are hard to do. It's hard to keep the presidency.
It is, and I agree with that. But here's the one problem with that, which is that every single trend is moving away to Republicans. Every major political trend is moving away to Republicans. Not every is too strong. Many of the major political trends in this country are moving against Republicans, and in a way that I think threatens their long-term viability long-term electability. And they can still be an effective congressional party, but it's going to be hard on the presidential level if they don't find a way to put the Tea Party at bay and to reach out to various other constituencies. I don't know how they do that. I really don't know how they do that. I'm sure that they have to find a way to do it, but I don't see how they do it in the near term. I think, and I actually have a feeling that and this is the thing about Romney, that even if he loses, and even having picked Ryan, I think that there will be a strong element within the party that will say, we picked a faux conservative and we can pick a real conservative. Right. I don't think they've hit bottom yet, is what I guess I'm saying. And I don't think even Romney losing, unless he gets swamped, as I doubt will happen, I just think that that they are going to say, we should have nominated, Rick Perry or Rick Santorum and we would have won. It's wrong, but that's what I think they'll say.
No, and it'll be interesting who that narrative centers around, right? Whether it'll be Santorum, whether it'll be that just 2012 was a disaster, kind of like 96 was a disaster, right? I mean, to the best of my recollection, they never really settled on, we should have nominated somebody other than Bob Dole, right? I mean, they settled on Bob Dole was not a great candidate, but they never said, but we should have nominated Jack Kemp because he would have done so much better.
Right,
so
but don't forget,
but
the response to losing in 96 and losing in 98 in the midterms was to run a guy who ran as a compassionate conservative, right? I mean, Bush did not run as a hard-edged conservative. He ran against the Republican Party in some especially the GOP, the House contingent. I just can't see that happening. But 4 years.
Right. No, I don't think you'll have moderation, but I do wonder whether the narrative will settle on we should have nominated this particular person rather than Romney. So,
but if they win. It's a whole different conversation. If they win,
right.
We can kiss the welfare state goodbye, I think is probably what you're going to say.
Right.
And on that happy note.
on that delightful note, I think we're going to bring this to a close. It has been a lot of fun.
Always a pleasure.
And, Foreign Entanglements viewers, thank you for checking in.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Good discussion.
All right.
All right.
Bye-bye.